judging from this morning. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce, as the chair of this panel, Mr. Tim O'Connor. Tim O'Connor has served the Republic of Ireland as a diplomatic servant for the past 33 years. He is fondly remembered here in New York as the Consul General in New York, and then became secretary to President Mary McAleese. Tim continues to serve Ireland both through industry, sitting on boards, especially sitting as the chair of the board of the Clinton Institute of University College Dublin. As I mentioned, Tim is really the matchmaker between our two institutes. Anyone who knows Tim knows that ability he has, the Shanachai. And without further ado, I'd like to ask Tim to come up, say a few words, and then introduce the panel.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, Brendan, for those kind words. I'm going to go pretty quickly to the speakers. We have a very distinguished panel, but just very briefly at the start, as having the honour to be the chair of the Clinton Institute for American Studies. Welcome, Amy Desai from the Clinton Foundation. We are very honoured to carry the name of President Clinton, our institute, and after the great work that's been done in getting the institute off to a very powerful academic start under the leadership, I like to pay tribute to the leadership of Dr. Liam Kennedy, the director, and his team. Catherine Carey, who's here as well. I think we felt over the last year or so that the time was right now to begin to bring it from the sort of very powerful academic platform that had been built in Dublin 4, to begin to bring it to other places and spaces as a resource, as I've been describing it, at the heart of the Ireland-America relationship. And so I am absolutely delighted that the first venture and the first journey in that, the first chapter in that journey has been here in Fordham in New York, both places very close to my own heart. And I think that and so first off, I'd also like to pay tribute in particular to Fordham as an institution, and to Father Joe McShane, the president of this great house with 4 Irish grandparents, and I was a very lucky man as the Consul General that the president of Fordham was somebody so close to ourselves and our hearts. And in particular, I want to pay tribute to the Institute of Humanitarian Studies, and the leadership of Brendan Cannell as our first partners in that journey of collaboration. And I think you could see this morning, for those here, the very robust engagement and debate that we had. As I said, there was nothing fluffy about that debate this morning. In fact, it was quite salty, and is exactly the kind of discourse you'd want to have in an Irish family gathering, in the Irish tribe gathering. Because ultimately this is, selfishly for us, as an Irish institution, this is, in the first instance, about our tribe. And I suppose one of my epiphanies as Consul General here 7 years ago, when I arrived, fresh-faced and innocent, well, 1 out of 2, the epiphany was actually the power of this extraordinary diaspora, this extraordinary tribe that is here, and the sense that we in Ireland don't understand the power that it is, and also the resource that it is. And in the journey in between, of trying to come to terms with all of that. And I think that today's, and I want to pay tribute as well to my very good friend Brendan Rogers, who is here as Director General of Irish Aid. The power of this particular gathering today, in some ways, is the docking of a modern foreign policy space that Ireland has taken a global leadership role in, with the United States and with others. Namely the fight against hunger, to bring that back to the city and to this place, this institution, Fordham, where in many ways the beginnings of the journey of outworking of our own famine was actually placed. There's a power in that we can't even begin to understand, but I'm so delighted we have this opportunity over these few hours today to begin exploring it, and to do so with some extraordinary people. And it was the last thing I'd say before introducing our first speaker, who is a great exemplar of this community, is that actually, for me as a professional coming here 7 years ago, was actually the way that this has the capacity, this place has the capacity to transform your own life as a professional. whatever job we do, we bring to bear our professionalism and our expertise and our experience. I guess what hadn't been prepared for was the way this place just takes hold of you and transforms your own life personally as well. And so the big thing for me, the really big bonus for me out of here was actually the friendships that have been formed and that have stayed with me. I left 5 years ago, and New York is still an absolute epicenter part of my own life. So in personal terms, it's a tremendous honor to be here. And the first speaker, I suppose in many ways, is a father figure of this community, of the tribe here, Dr. Kevin Cahill. We could be here I could be here for a long time to do justice to Kevin and the contribution that he has made and continues to make over many generations. And his own personal story and his family story is actually the story of the famine journey out of Ireland. His grandfather leaving Kerry to come here, and very quickly through the power of education, his own father, a very distinguished doctor in the Bronx, and the young Kevin, tripping around the Bronx, carrying the bag of his father and getting the first taste of medicine, not just of medicine though, but the power of medicine to transform lives. And in between, in his own distinguished career, in the decades since then, the contribution that Kevin Cahill has made. And it was very fitting that, it is very fitting that our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Kevin Cahill, a legend of Irish America and a legend of international humanitarian affairs. Dr. Kevin Cahill.
Thank you very much. You forget, now that Tim's out of town, how flattering he is to everyone. So you take those words, they come in and they go out. But I thought, in preparing, I was going to be on the second panel, and I explained this. I'm explaining why I'm on this. One person couldn't show for today. The other problem was that Mr. Obama and half of the police department were outside of my office all morning, so a good half of the patients just couldn't get even near there, and they're still sitting in the office. So I thank the organizers for allowing me to speak here. Obviously, Brendan and I have spoken often about it, and I'm delighted that your morning went well. Someone described it salty comments and good comments. And there was an American politician, I think it was first Alice Smith, and then FDR used to say, thing in life is to always look at the facts. And so in preparing for this, I drew upon a paper that Brendan Rogers actually helped me set up for a book that I have coming out in August entitled More with Less. It comes out of my work down at the United Nations, where there's just no question that there is less money for the things that we think we'd like to do, disasters. People aren't even giving the rhetoric to it anymore. They're just saying, no, we don't have any money. So in that book, I have a chapter using Ireland as a case study. A chapter on a country that's very proud of their identity with hunger and famine. But there's a reality. The reality is that starting a number of years ago, the economy collapsed. As I was showing to Brendan before, if you stay with the facts are that between 2007 and 2011, disaster relief from the Irish budget dropped from 121 million to 66 million. It's going to take a long time. History tells us to go back up again. It's not really, as I say, Brendan, also 3 out of my 4 nephews in Kerry are in Australia now. So people have real problems at home. They're not going to. Sympathy will be there, I think, and individual giving may be there, but from a couple point of view, and Ron Murphy's chapter with details, there was a lot of planning in the good years. They really did wonderful jobs of how they handled disasters. That, I think, will allow them to have almost an inordinate impact over these lean years that are coming ahead. The lean years are there. They're going to touch almost all aspects of what Ireland has traditionally done, including their work with United Nations agencies. They're trying to narrow down, trying to support some NGOs who will narrow down. But that, I think, is the salt that I'm all trying to offer to this symposium here. It is not going to change easily. Now, just last week we had President of Ireland speak at the American Irish Historical Society. And he spoke about identity and adaptation. And the more Tim was talking about the diaspora and the tribes, it reminded me of a place I worked for many, many years in Somalia. I remember someone saying to me in the desert one night in the middle of a famine, you have to choose between God and your tribe. Choose your tribe. Because you're not going to get out of it alive if you don't have a tribe. So Ireland does have this tribe. They have this diaspora all over the place. I remember at a meeting in Farnley a few years ago, people were talking about diaspora as being Irish descendants, your grandfather. The diaspora is even more. I taught in Ireland for 36 years. I taught over 4,000 medical students during that time. An inordinate number of them came from Nigeria, and India, and South Africa. And there's nothing like falling in love for the first time in college or buying your first car. I said to someone recently, the Prime Minister of Mauritius, as a College of Surgeons graduate, and he calls me on the phone and talks about his love of Ireland. So I think there's a lot out there that may help during these difficult times ahead. Times, the budgets are going to be down, people who have good programs, the concerns and the troubles, well, they're going to survive, but they're going to have more difficulty. I don't know what was said about those organizations, but there are real dangers in humanitarian, by the way, coming down the pipe. If you take even the UN, there's a concept now that they want everything to be addressed as one, so that politics and the military are being lumped in with the humanitarian work. And that's going to compromise what most of us who have spent our life in humanitarian work, in neutrality and impartiality. So I can see the changes coming across the board. I think they're going to come to Ireland. Ireland, I think, will survive because of the people who are reflected in this room, but it's not going to be easy. The other is talk, and then maybe we'll have questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate that very much. And we will have an opportunity for questions. We're largely looking in this section in very particular terms at the role of governments and NGOs. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, who is a very senior official of the US government in this space. And that's Greg Gottlieb, who is, if I could just say a few words about you, Greg, before you come with you. Greg was recently named as the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Food Security, and that's a relatively newly established entity of the Department of State. And Greg has spent many years working in the humanitarian space and in the food security space, and he's a very distinguished reputation there. Served in the field. He was just telling me that he was most recently in Namibia, and we were also talking beforehand about the commitment of his boss, also fellow Clintonite, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and the huge interest that the Secretary of State personally has in this, and of course the leadership role that she has given, not just in terms of what the United States is doing, but from our point of view, the tremendous collaboration that's taking place between Ireland and the United States in this space under the leadership of Secretary Clinton. And we're delighted that Greg is here with us today to give directly the perspective of the US government on all of this. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Greg Gottlieb.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's I know I'm getting a little bit older. I see Tom is here and Brendan's here, and I think I've been out in the field even longer than some of you. So I'm glad to still be in the business, but I know that I'm hoping that there's a younger generation coming up behind. A lot of the issues that I wanted to cover today in terms of sort of moving into what the U.S. government is doing, Tom and Brendan and others have already talked about, but I think it's worthwhile talking about it from the U.S. government perspective. I think we're still a big dog in the world of relief and development. Our budget, I know the budget, Dr. Cahill was just talking about the decline in the Irish budget. In fact, I think for our humanitarian budget, has actually been maintained pretty well over the years. It's changed in its nature, but it still remains incredibly robust. Where our budget has declined somewhat is in food. But as somebody pointed out earlier, if you look at Somalia, I think it was David Rife was talking about it, what was actually unique this time about food was that in Somalia was that it was done electronically. We did it with vouchers. We did it with cell phones. So there's a lot of things that are happening out there, and in my more than 30 years of doing humanitarian assistance, I think there's a lot of huge changes that have taken place. And I have to, it's a pleasure actually in one sense when you're in government to be not just a driver of change, but to actually do the changes yourself. And I think this year for us was a bit of a watershed in that while our food, the amount of food that we actually distributed was down, the amount of food that was supplied was up and was done in a way that makes sense. In fact, if you look at Somalia from your history, you go back to '92 when Fred Cuny was active there. That's when we first started to use the private sector in Somalia. So shift forward 20 years, and we're really doing it, except we're doing it at really a local level. So there's a lot of good things happening. So I look at price spikes back in 2007, 2008, and that actually, when those price spikes hit both in oil and food, that was really the low point for USAID in terms of our development work in agriculture and food security. We had a robust humanitarian program, and we had a laggard of an agriculture program. In fact, agriculture for us had gone from 20% down to less than 3% by 2008. It was the low point ever of our budget. The Green Revolution came. I think people felt that the revolution was won. We could all put down our muskets and we could all go home. But in fact, the revolution really didn't touch Africa much. And if you look at places like Ethiopia now, and Kenya and others, the amount of hybrid seed that's used, just hybrid, we're not talking GMO, just hybrid, less than 4% of farmers use even hybrid seed. So production levels remain very low. On the other hand, in the industrialized world, we are beginning to bump up against the limits of what we can do with our own hybrid seeds, that level of production. So that is another factor as we look at what will happen to our markets. The decline of ODA, official development assistance, it's gone down seriously over the years. And I was just looking at a statistic from Japanese ODAs dropped from 15 billion to 10 billion over the last couple of years. Tsunami certainly had something to do with that. But the fact is that as ODA declines, private sector flows into the developing world are increasing. So then what's the role of government as our portion of what goes into the developing world? What's our influence in that money? And I want to touch on that a little bit. So I'll just focus a little bit on L'Aquila and how it changed what we're doing now at USAID. So there was L'Aquila Summit in 2009. Donors committed $22 billion. The U.S. committed $3.5 billion of that over a 3-year period. The good part is that we've reached that, in our budgeting process, we already reached that 3rd year, and we're 2 years budgeting beyond that. So the good part for the U.S. government is we really do anticipate, I think, a real commitment in the future to food security. And what we've done over time, over the last couple of years, is consolidate all of our disparate parts in USAID, and we are a pretty large organization. We have consolidated all that into a single entity, and that's the entity that I'm in charge of now. We've tried to change our approach to what we do in food security. We're called Feed the Future. We've got 19 focus countries. We're not trying to be everywhere. That certainly is something that everybody has pointed out. Dr. Cahill just pointed that out. The fact is that you try to narrow. I think one of the reasons we've narrowed is because it's a belief, strong belief by our administrator that if we can focus our resources in a country and have a major impact over a few years, we can move on to other places, as opposed to thinning out our investments over many, many countries and not really having the impact we want. We're building our programs on CADA, those of you that know CADA, which is a very African-driven system with a peer review of investment plans and of agricultural budgets. We've tried to, as I said, want to take a value chain approach. We want to look at not just production, but we want to look at employment along the whole value chain. Because not everybody is going to be a successful farmer, not everybody is going to stay as a farmer, but there are other jobs that are needed along the way, and we want to focus Many people have mentioned sun and the 1,000 days. Nutrition is a big part of what we do. In the past, we focused a lot on micronutrients, just as nutrition is a micronutrient. Now we want to focus on the whole diet. We want to make that diet better, more diverse. A lot of us have had the experience of getting people to grow kitchen gardens so they could sell that produce for income, but they weren't eating those products. Those are important features of any good diet, so that kids are not going to have the kind of stunting that we see. We've also tried to expand our research agenda. We've doubled the amount of money in the last 2 years that we put into research. And we've used an extensive process in the United States, Purdue University, to try to look over that research. And a lot of our focus is going to be on drought-resistant seed or climate-resistant seed, so that we can target the areas in which we think we really see an impact coming for agriculturalists. And finally, one of the areas we really are trying to look at is public-private partnerships. USA has done a lot of work with the private sector in the past, but we've looked at it from a philanthropic point of view. I can think of the first one we did was with Chevron Oil in Angola. They handed us $50 million and said, see what you can do with this. Now what we're trying to do is to look at corporations and see what's in their best interest in terms of their profits. Not that we're turning into it's not, I think, a massive change in the way we look at things, but what we're trying to do is to see where they want to invest in terms of sustainability. Because we figure that if they are willing to invest, and we can help support that investment and help target those investments to those that really need it, then we'll get the benefit we want from our funding. I want to take a quick look at what happened in the Horn of Africa recently and what's happening in the Sahel now, and use that as a way to look at what I think the role of government is. So, Tom and others have talked about, David talked about what's happened in the Horn of Africa. I think just one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that when I look at what American nonprofits were able to raise for that last drought in the Horn, our contribution from USAID was over $1 billion, just for this in the last year. But I think NGOs raised maybe $60, $70 million in the US. That's really not, I think what's true is that it's very difficult to raise funds for slow onset disasters. Fast onset disasters like a tsunami, like an earthquake, are easy to raise funds. But it's these slow onset ones that make it very difficult. And it is why I think there is such a tight connection between NGOs and government. Because of the magnitude of what you have to do good famine relief, the cost of it, and the need for governments to have partners who know what they're doing. So in the Sahel, in the Horn this year, we know where the famine took place. These are places in which we have poured humanitarian relief for years and years and years. And yet we realize that these are areas in which we've invested very little of our development money. And I think that is what we hope to be changing in the near future. I think there's been a real recognition on the part of the Obama administration that we need to start moving more of our money into those areas to get some balance. And just about a little over a month ago, we met many donors met in Nairobi to talk about forming an alliance around resilience and growth in the Horn of Africa. I think what's significant about that is, at least from USAID's perspective, is it really is one of the first times that I think we will strongly and have strongly brought together our relief and development. From a bureaucratic standpoint, you have a flow of funds that goes into relief, and you have another stovepipe over here where you get development money. And having been both sides of that both sides of the house now in aid, I know how people on the humanitarian side are protective of their money, and how the development people say, well, those humanitarian people, you know, they just have a limited scope of view of the world, and we have our side over here and we know what we're doing. We actually brought our humanitarian and our development people around the same table for the last several months to design a joint program where their money is going in together to be just as part of the transition program and then onto the longer term program. But to make those longer term programs have the kind of flexibility that they can respond quickly to the next drought that's going to come. And from all I hear from the Fan River warning system, we may be seeing that sooner than later, even this year. But what we also looked at was how donors could come together around a joint framework that's being developed by EGAD out in the Horn. How we could develop stronger regional partnerships. How we could work around a common monitoring and evaluation system. And how we could be mutually accountable for what each of us does, whether it's what we do as donors, whether it's what NGOs do, or whether it's what governments do. And that's what we're kind of after out there. You know, I was just saying to Brendan that, you know, we've got a task in front of us that's this big. And if we can get this much of it done and do it well, we will have at least taken some more steps forward, I think, in the evolution of what we do in humanitarian assistance. So for us, it's trying to apply a lot of the same principles that we've used on the development side to taking our humanitarian assistance and joining it with our development work. And as I look ahead to what the role of government is, I still see that we are, I would really sort of second a lot of what Brendan said. We need to be at the center of coordination. We need to be working to develop local capacity. And we need to really, I think, we need to do a better job of how we do our internal work to make sure that we are not the cause of some of the disjuncture around how humanitarian assistance gets done. I think NGOs for us remain key partners. As I said, there's a lot that still needs to be done out there that governments themselves cannot do. We are not implementers. We don't send our people out there to load the trucks anymore. We don't do that anymore. We need NGOs, we need the UN, and we need local organizations who really know their populations to best serve them. And finally, I do think that we, for all the headaches that if you're a government official you run into, I do think that we need NGOs as advocates. Government, I think, as I said, has a strong role to play in what's going to happen in terms of policy and how we do our humanitarian assistance. But I do think that we need advocates out there because we need to see the other side of things. And government can get a little bit closed, and I think that's what the NGOs do. They bring a fresh perspective, particularly as younger voices come in and keep us honest and keep us moving ahead. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Greg. That was a very interesting overview, and we also salute your own personal passion, because it's very clear that you're a public servant, but you're also very personally passionate and committed, and that came across today. We'll have to check later on to see what kind of Irish roots we can find in the Gottliebs, but that may take a little bit longer, but we'll work on that. Yes, okay, very good. Sitting beside on the right hand side of Greg, in fact, is the other Irish government representative, the other government representative here, Brendan Rogers. For those of you who are not here this morning, very distinguished Director General of Irish Aid. Now, Brendan isn't going to speak at this session because he already spoke this morning, and he has a rule as a Dundalk man that you never speak twice in the same session. But, we might get him to answer a few questions afterwards. But for those who weren't here today, he is a legend of the Irish Foreign Service, and I'm a bit biased because he's also a very good friend. We joined the Foreign Service on this week 33 years ago, and he's been a great friend ever since. I'm very proud of the tremendous work he does. So our final speaker on this panel is a man very close to our own heart at the Clinton Institute, because he's the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor of the William J. Clinton Foundation, the man who gives us the name to our institute, the Clinton Institute for American Studies, and whom we're very proud to represent. So Ami himself is a very distinguished official. He has done many things, public and private sector, worked in the private sector before he joined the Clinton Institute, and he's on the management committee of the Haiti Development Fund, established by President Clinton, Carla Slim, and Frank Wistra in 2010. And he was also alleged, before he joined the Clinton Foundation, he was alleged to aid to, of course, the then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, with responsibility for foreign affairs, including Africa, humanitarian affairs, and international trade. So he comes with a very, very strong personal track record himself, and now he's bringing all that talent to bear in this very powerful foundation that President Clinton is driving in life after public office. So we're delighted, Amy, that you're here with us, and we look forward to your words. Amy Desai.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to Liam and everyone at Fordham for having me here. I just wanted to take a step back from the things we've talked about to just try to frame this discussion a little more broadly, which is to say, when we're talking about hunger, we're actually talking about women's issues, climate change, technology, and so when we talk about the kinds of things that the private sector or governments or NGOs can do when it comes to hunger, those are actually much broader questions. And when we talk about budgets, as Greg was saying, if you look at one stovepipe, you actually may miss what the other stovepipe is doing that actually directly impacts hunger issues. I'll tell you a little bit about what President Clinton is doing and then just save as much time as possible for questions. He, as governor of Arkansas, is intimately familiar with agricultural issues and did a lot while president as well. In his post-presidency, we have, from a nonprofit perspective, been doing a few main things. But I think our two objectives, if I had to summarize them, were first, to provide philanthropic capital and assistance where the private sector doesn't find it appealing or governments can. And then our second objective, as President Clinton always says, is to work ourselves out of a job. He said that in the Haitian context and really everywhere, that every NGO in the world hopefully is working towards reducing dependence on its efforts rather than increasing. We have done that through work in Malawi, Rwanda, Peru, Colombia, Haiti, and I'll give you a few examples. In Malawi, the way in which we've addressed hunger issues is to operate a 1,000-hectare commercial farm that is surrounded by about 10,500 smallholder farmers. And what we do is our large farm is purchase fertilizer and seeds and equipment and all of the inputs that you would think are needed on a farm. And the very simple thing that we do is extend the pricing that we're able to negotiate to all of the surrounding smallholder farmers, so that the cost of their inputs go down, often by 50 or 75%. And then at the end of the season, we aggregate their produce with ours when we go to market. And along the way, we also provide them with technical assistance in the planting and maintenance of the crops. And so at the end of the day, what we've found is in just 1 or 2 growing seasons, their incomes have increased by 500 or 600%. And it's a very dramatic thing. They produce food for themselves, but also to sell to others, so it addresses food security in the region as well. We also, in Rwanda, have done something slightly different, which is to invest in agribusinesses. So one of the things that we found, Rwanda is a country of about 9 million people. Half a million are coffee farmers. The coffee in Rwanda is very, very good. I don't know if you've had it, but because of the altitude and the soil and the climate patterns, it's very, very good coffee. And what we found is that you have this huge number of farmers who are producing coffee, and then the green beans get exported somewhere else and roasted and packaged somewhere else outside of Rwanda. And President Kagame noticed this and asked President Clinton for help. And so we now have joined with local investors to invest in the construction of a coffee roasting and packaging facility in Kigali, so that all of that value-added processing can stay within country, hopefully lift Rwanda's GDP, contribute to their tax base, and in the meantime provide a market for the about 20,000 coffee farmers that will have an opportunity to sell to this company. And so hopefully sustainably lift their incomes as well. So it's not traditional charity when it comes to hunger issues, but a much more long-term, financially self-sustaining view. In Colombia, we've done a few different things, one of which is more traditional. We have partnered with a local NGO founded by Shakira to provide school meals to about 3.2 million meals we've provided. That is part of a program that she created to provide education to these students, and what we found is that students are much less likely to learn if they're hungry, and so we provided the school meal as part of that program. We also have done something very interesting in Cartagena. There are 6 5-star hotels in Cartagena, and what we found was that basically none of their sourcing occurred locally. They imported everything from tablecloths to tomatoes from elsewhere in Colombia or elsewhere in the region. And on the other hand, we saw this local base of smallholder families and farmers that were producing all kinds of things that probably could be useful for the hotel chains if there was an opportunity for them to connect. And so we did something that we called an inverse trade fair, where we rented out a space and we got the 6 hotels together. They came equipped with a list of all of the things that they would need for the next 12 months. And then we made that available to about 250 local families who were producing things that were on that list. And they were able to forge direct relationships that now continue without any help from President Clinton. And together, those 250 families have sold about $1 million worth of products to these companies. So it's a very dramatic increase in income for these families. It, again, lifts the economic well-being of their communities. They're able to feed themselves. And from the hotel's perspective, it's cheaper than importing all of these things from elsewhere. So again, the role that we played was filling that gap that no one else was filling. In Peru, we've done something totally different, which is hunger in rural areas in Peru, particularly amongst children, is not necessarily just because of the lack of availability of food. It's also largely because of a lack of awareness on the parts of the mothers and the families on how to cook and prepare food and the kinds of foods that you should be providing to kids. So it wasn't so much a hunger issue as a nutrition problem. And so we've been working with several local NGOs and with the local government to try to educate families on how to prepare food and what kinds of foods to feed to children. And so that program also is now reaching thousands of families in rural areas of Peru. In Haiti, again, a country of about 9 million people, the vast majority of people in Haiti are food insecure by the standards that you or I would know. There's a long history that explains that, but one of the things that President Clinton is doing today to try to reverse that is bringing international companies into Haiti, both agricultural equipment companies and seed companies, but also purchasers, to try to help stimulate local production and educate local farmers who largely have a talent base, but are dealing with land that's been severely degraded, and also generally lack equipment and fertilizer and seeds and all the things that farmers need to do their jobs well. So, for example, in November last year, President Clinton hosted what we called a coffee summit, which brought together 70 international retailers and purchasers and processors of coffee, took them to Haiti, connected them with the local Haitian Coffee Growers Associations, and those discussions are ongoing and the investments are ongoing, and it will take a long time to build back the coffee sector in Haiti. But like Rwanda, Haitian coffee is very, very good, and once was considered the best in the world. And so we're hopeful we can bring it back. Those are some of the things that we've been doing through the foundation. President Clinton also tries to bring attention to global hunger issues and hunger-related efforts through the Clinton Global Initiative, where Tom and Concern and lots of other NGOs have participated and done all kinds of interesting things. The one NGO that came to mind when I was preparing for this is Heifer International, which has a very unique approach to addressing hunger issues. They have been an active participant in CGI as well. So that's a little bit about what President Clinton has been doing, and I'd be happy to go further with that.
you very much, Amit, and just to say to you that we look forward to continue to work, at the Clinton Institute, work very closely with you, and we're available to help with that great work. And listening to the story from Cartagena and the hotels, I couldn't help thinking that President Clinton continues to have the genius for seeing the gaps and bringing people together, like of course he did in our peace process for so long as well. Before throwing the matters open to the floor, Brendan Rogers, did you want had you any comment to make?
I think 30 minutes of me this morning was enough.
Thank you, dear Brendan. I can always rely on you not to let me down. Before the questions, I want to make one other comment, just almost on a personal basis, because this conference, Liam and Brendan Cale have done such a fantastic job in pulling together, is taking place in Fordham. And there are many members, leading members of the Irish American community here whom I warmly welcome. I see Loretta Brennan Glucksman here, President of the Ireland Funds, and John Connorton, and the work and others, the work that Loretta and others have done in leadership in the community here has been fantastic. And to me, as arriving here 7 years ago, and also reflecting to our theme today of hunger and dealing with famine, and if you throw into the mix as well what Dr. Kevin Cale talked about, the reality of our situation in Ireland today, where we are facing very serious economic crisis and very serious difficulties. In many ways, for me, the question about can the Irish survive, can we come back? There is actually an answer to that question already in history, and it's here in America, it's here in New York in particular. Because the story of Irish America, in many ways, is a story of survival, of beginning again, and of prospering anew. And I don't think that's fully appreciated at home. So for me personally, one of the pieces, and including in a conference like this, it is actually about knitting that journey together. We are in a state of crisis at home. There is a huge crisis of confidence. But I'm actually very hopeful we will find our way back, because history has shown that as a people, that actually we have that capacity in the genes to do that. And I just want to take this opportunity, while I have the privilege of the microphone, to say that, and to say how much we are inspired by Irish America and what it has achieved. So can I now throw up the floor if there are any questions? If anybody has a question, you might actually do us the honour of going to the microphone. Going to the microphone. Thank you. If you might say your name, please. Thanks.
Will Galvin. If I could maybe make a brief comment first, and maybe make a good two questions to the panel. I think one of the things that perhaps wasn't mentioned this morning is when we talk about hunger. One of the words that I think is really important is farming and farmers. And the experience, we were talking this morning about the Irish hunger memory, but I think maybe one of the connections between the Irish hunger experience and the Irish work in the humanitarian sector is that the Irish have been quite good farmers and kind of brought some of that farming knowledge to bear. A fact that I keep coming back to when I discuss this with some people is that the largest cheese producer in the United States is an Irish company, Glanbia. That's a lot of cheese. And it started as a small cooperative run by farmers in the south-east coast of Ireland in the 1960s. And one of the largest and most successful food ingredients business in the last 20 years has been Kerry Co-op, also a small co-op started by farmers. So just a question from that to Brendan, if I might. The success of Irish agribusiness has been really impressive in the last 20 years in particular around the world. I wonder if you would maybe comment on that, the bit where Irish aid connects to that, in the sense of the continuing reach out to the private sector in terms of Ireland's development work. And if I might just, still have the mic, if I could just say one other quick one for Greg, conscious as well that you may be able to only address a little bit of this, but the winds of change that have been brought through by the Obama administration and the Feed the Future initiative, which has been really, really impressive. How much of that relies on the current political conviction holding sway. I'm referring in particular to the Ryan budget, which would in effect mean the end of Feed the Future. What commitment is there, do you think, within government at large to a programme like Feed the Future?
Thanks very much, Will. Brendan?
Thanks very much. Very interesting question. I think really farmers were the subtext of all of the discussion that we had this morning. As I mentioned, the Hunger Task Force, one of the key recommendations was that we would have to be working with farmers, and particularly women farmers. The vast majority of food in Africa is provided still by subsistence farmers. And the vast majority of farmers are women. 80% of the farmers in Africa are women. So if we want to increase food security, we have got to work with subsistence farmers, and we've got to work with women farmers. Absolutely. And certainly from our perspective, a lot of the money that we're putting into Africa at the moment is focusing on agriculture, but on areas related with agriculture as well. We are focusing on leading edge pro research to increase the outputs of seeds, to ensure that pro farmers have at their disposal the very best technology can produce. But your other question, I think, is very interesting in terms of Glanbia and Kerry Co-op and many of the other food industry in Ireland is one of the most successful of our exports. You know that, billions every year. And we have just launched about 2 months ago a very innovative program between the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Agriculture. And I used to work with the Department of Agriculture many, many years ago. An Africa Agri-Food Development Fund that will look at innovative connections between the Irish agri-food industry and the agri-food industry in Africa, focusing initially on 2 pilot countries, Tanzania and Kenya. We're hopeful if this begins to work well, it is something that we can scale up. But absolutely, we have to work with farmers, absolutely have to look at agriculture if we are going to reduce hunger and if we're going to tackle it.
Thanks. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Will, for the question. I'll just say one of the things I think I would add to what Brendan said was that there is an emphasis on smallholder farmers for our program, and there's also a huge emphasis on women. And one of the things that we used to do a lot of was we used to give a lot of scholarships, and people came to the United States and were educated. So ministers in Africa, many of the ministers in Africa that we meet now, ministers of ag, are U.S. educated. We stopped doing that. And we started to do that again through a program called Borlaug, where we're taking actually women scientists to come to the States again and get a master's or a PhD. So we're trying to focus that education money on women, which is, I think, a needed change in our program. But let me go to the political will issue. Interestingly enough, 2007, 2008, so at the end of the Bush administration, so I was the co-chair of a task force on food security at the National Security Council. And the point is that the Bush administration itself was very interested in this and pushed for the first $1 billion that we had in terms of responding to that crisis. A lot of that was on food at the time, but that administration was interested. So it was not surprising to me to be called back to start up a bureau on food security, because in fact Republicans were as keen on it as the Democrats. This is something that we, at least from my perspective on the Hill, in Congress, there's pretty good bipartisan support, and I have to put a plug in for my administrator, Raj Shah, who I think has been a tireless proponent of food security as an issue that cuts across both sides of the aisle. And I think he's done a fantastic job of sort of depoliticizing the issue, making an issue about what people in the world, what issues people in the world face, and what the U.S. government can do to help. And as I said, we're already 2 years into our budgeting process, past when Feed the Future is supposed to end. And that, I think, says a lot about, I think, where we'll be. I would expect that, I mean, budgets, Brendan and I were talking, you know, budgets are like this. They go up, they go down. Some years they're great, some years they're not so great. But I do think that by consolidating our work under this new bureau, we're going to get a lot more bang for our buck. So even if we go down some, things will get better and the budget will go back up. But I do think it's an issue that everybody can get around. The downside of it is that there are other parts of our agency that don't do as well as we do. And one of those parts is democracy and governance. And I think that we'd all agree that that is a key part of doing good food security work because of the need to have transparency in how governments work. So I'm hopeful that budgets come back up.
Can I also just add one thing? There are two things that we can do that are budget neutral. And I just want to echo what Greg was saying about President Bush's commitment. President Clinton often talks about President Bush's leadership in encouraging more local sourcing of food aid. And so that is something that doesn't necessarily have to have an impact on the budget, but you can do, and it addresses hunger issues and stimulates local smallholder production. The other thing that you can do is, in times of scarcity, use each dollar more effectively. And Raj and Secretary Clinton and others in the U.S. government, and certainly on both sides, have been very interested in looking at how each $8 is spent and trying to reduce the amount of that is going to overhead. And so those kinds of things, I think, again, can be budget neutral and are not really political, but just require a little bit of hard work. So.
Can I just add one thing to that as well? We've been talking about what we're doing. Greg will do, what Clinton will do, what Ireland will do. But in the final analysis, it's what the governments themselves will do. They have got to put agriculture up the agenda. And we've got to begin to put reasonable budgets into that. The budgets have collapsed, really, essentially. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, those governments themselves have got to take ownership of the agriculture agenda, essentially. So we can't do it alone. It has to be done in partnership. That's what I was talking about this morning, about that importance of partnership.
Kevin, do you want to add?
No, I was thinking of Somalia, where I was in December. I first went there in 1962, so I've had a long term. They were trying, in my capacity as the chief advisor on humanitarian public health issues for the President of the United Nations, the Secretary General, and they said exactly what Brendan was just saying to the government. We'll pay for you to be extra reported. You have to be transparent. You have to be seen as transparent. And Somalia is in a bad case right now. I always thought, why does God spare us? Because we all were Dominic and everyone from Fusman. But I went there and I met the very small NGO community in Mogadishu. And 4 days later, the head of Doctors Without Borders and the doctors were shot to death in his office. So these are very troubled, very difficult places to work. The very critical thing that they have to move, as Brendan says, something like agriculture up, and they have to be transparent.
And I think just to add on that, I was saying in my remarks, there is this CADUP process, not a perfect process, but what CADUP does at least is it looks at a peer review of, it matches up with the country's ag plan with its investments, with its budget, so that, I know in the case of Kenya, for instance, when they submitted their plan, the peer review said, look, it's one thing to have a great sounding plan, but you're not really putting any money into it. And I think one of the things that we're faced with right now is that as we look at further investments in Kenya and Ethiopia, what we're looking for is in their next round of budget, are they really going to put the money in those areas? Because if we're going to invest in there, they have to invest. They have to invest in the sense of letting those, putting their amount of money in there, but also letting those groups, letting that local government operate with the kind of openness that I think we feel is necessary to make the most out of the investments. And we'll see how that happens. I mean, it's not like we haven't been disappointed before, but I do think that there are some good things that are happening out there that give us hope that we might be able to get some more things done in those difficult areas.
Thanks very much. Our friends have been waiting very patiently. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having this type of event. And I work, Bob Larrick, I work with the UN NGO community and the faith community. We had worked on a whole UN World Spirituality Summit for the new millennium and 21st century leadership, and the Millennium Goals, of which are not doing so well either. And the idea of, I think you bring up the importance of food as an international forum. I believe is having a graduation next week. My son just graduated at St. John this Sunday. The need to leave our children a better world in the food issue and challenging our leaders and government, as you brought up, in terms of the executive capacity, capacity building on the food issue, and what is the, actually Ireland is part of the European Union. We have a G8 coming up shortly, talking about budgets collapsing, which is apparently true. Chase just collapsed. I proposed a good government, holistic, multidimensional interfaith business security and development alliance, which is a mouthful, but the idea of war and killing each other is not healthy for food. The issue of the UN, which we seem to de-emphasize so much today, but has a tremendous capacity, as well as actually work with people who started the UN actually, literally, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter, and the need to go back and look at these things again in our global village, technological village. The world is very different, and nationalism isn't really the answer to our problems, but the need for the World Economic Forum seems to be so much ahead of our own American government, but I believe the Clinton Foundation also can do much more about speaking up about the need for a more effective UN and Bretton Woods system. Ireland also, as part of the European Union, is a member of those issues, and the need to build up greater capacity. And don't we need to challenge our government leaders to do more, particularly with the end of the week, I believe, the G8 meeting, and the food issue, and even in the development in this country. I mean, I'm in Westchester, 20% of Westchester has hunger issues. I mean, our schools, there's something wrong. The need for cooperatives, the need for cooperation, the mental health NGO, which I represented, is a collaborative orientation. It's a science and sanity. It's not religious, but it's the idea of the human potential and the potential for moving together for more functional solutions. And doesn't the food issue provide an opportunity for the world, in particular at this moment, for better risk management solutions and the need for support for a more effective UN and Bretton Woods financial system for food?
Thanks very much, and congratulations to your son. And I'm taking the question on that really is about the role of the UN, and making sure that continues to be a greater focus on the role of the UN.
Exactly, and the possibilities on the food issue, on the universities. I believe the idea of actually religion and science, you get better understanding rather than competition.
Great, thank you very much. So, Kevin, have you? The UN?
I think all of us try to use our little positions to get things into, say, a president's speech. And you know that if you get, in this instance, agriculture in, or hunger, or food, the President of the General Assembly outranks, I mean, he's the senior, and I managed to get two things into his opening speech. One was on disaster risk reduction, and one was on Somalia, which was an old love affair of mine. And so we all try in our ways to move, and I think the benefit of a meeting like this is to stimulate each of us to do what we can in our own ways, and if I continue, I will be a better person for listening to all these speakers about hunger and famine and there. But as I say, I think the UN is, to me, is absolutely critical. Peter Hansen, who's in the front row here, was the head of the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, UN, and he's now diplomat in residence at Forum. So I mean, that cross-fertilization between academia and the UN is very much alive, very important.
Thank you. Brendan?
Well, look, I think the hunger agenda is certainly one of the highest priorities the current United Nations Secretary General has. He's established a high-level task force. He's put a fantastic human being in charge of it, David Navarro. I've worked with David over many, many years. He's making an enormous contribution. He's put the issue of nutrition, as I mentioned this morning, on that agenda. We have a revolution happening on the ground in 27 countries in terms of dealing with nutrition. And nutrition goes beyond that, just hunger agenda, education, women's equality, children's rights, all the things that him and everyone. So I think the UN is doing as much as it possibly can, but as Kevin said, it is up to us. The UN is made up of all of us, all the member states, 191 of us, and it's up to us, in a sense, to influence it. We are the UN. It's not disconnected from us whatsoever. And overall, I do think we're going in the right direction. I think post-2015, if there's MDGs or whatever, the MDGs phase 2, hunger will be on that agenda. Millennium Development Goals.
Thank you.
The new MDGs or the SDGs or whatever they're going to call, hunger will be on that agenda. So the UN has a major role to play, the key role really in many respects in relation to the multilateral system.
Thanks. Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the statistics that are thrown around about how many more people there will be, and by 2015, how much more food we have to grow. I think it's a pretty compelling argument for governments and the UN, which we make up, to pursue ardently reform of that agenda. I mean, what Brendan's talking about, I mean, David Navarro's been on this now for the last 40 years. Hopefully he'll keep doing it for a while. But I think we all recognized just some years back, 4 or 5 years back, that if we didn't start focusing on this, we weren't going to have a lot of, we were going to be in a lot of hot water. And I think this whole focus on nutrition, broadening how we approach nutrition, is going to have a real impact. Just even the way that, as Tom explained, and Brendan explained how we do our therapeutic feeding now, the things that we've done to help preserve populations' health during the worst of times. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on, and I think from the USG perspective, this is an initiative that the president is just so keen on. I mean, he is really devoted to this. It's obvious the secretary remains devoted to it, and so do we as a USA. And I would expect that we'll keep doing this for many years in the future, because it's an issue that really easily crosses all the lines in terms of politics. It's hard to say. It's hard to say no to humanitarian assistance, but and hopefully it will be equally as hard to say no to feeding people well over many years to come.
Thank you. Sammy?
I just want to echo what Brendan said, which is that it's easy to say that the UN, as an amorphous institution out there, should do more on hunger, but it really is all of us, and so I think we have to reverse that question and ask ourselves, what can each one of us do? Greg was talking about the population trends and the demographic trends. If it's true that between now and 2050 there's going to be an increase in the world population to 9 million people, that's a lot more mouths to feed. And what President Clinton talks about, and that's against the backdrop of increasing water scarcity, probably stagnation in arable lands, or perhaps a slight decrease, and also against the backdrop of climate change and its effects, which are particularly bad on coastal regions, many of which produce a lot of food currently. So you have all of these things happening, and one of the things that President Clinton talks about is that for the last 20 years, or probably 30 years, there was a shift, mistakenly, including under his administration, away from agricultural investments in local economies, where the percentage of overseas development assistance for the United States, but also for a lot of other donor governments, the proportion dedicated to agriculture decreased relative to other things. And so the question now is, there's generally a recognition that we need to do more investing in local agriculture. And so, President Obama and President Bush and Bob Zoellick at the World Bank and a lot of folks have been working on this, certainly the Irish government. I know the numbers have decreased, but the remarkable thing is that if you look at the donor countries in the world, despite the recession, Ireland has been relatively steadfast compared with other donors, with the exception of the US in terms of its overseas development assistance. And it's a testament to the commitment of the Irish people and the Irish government to this work. So anyway, I think that there are a lot of good things happening. There's obviously an enormous need in the world, otherwise none of us would be here today. So there's a lot more that each one of us can and should do.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you very much for the very good question. Very briefly.
Do you think the cost of food to our nation as well as other nations can be an impetus to focus on these issues more?
Maybe one person might take that, because thank you very much. Appreciate it. Craig?
Well, I'm sure that, there will be some kind of product. People see that food prices, if people think and understand about what rising food prices mean to them, hopefully we can explain well enough what the consequences are for others who are, less well-to-do. I would say that, if I can shift off of that for a minute, I think that, one of the things that, as a development agency, is difficult to do in the United States is for us to have attention on longer-term development issues as opposed to humanitarian issues. Humanitarian issues play very well across the nation, but development is a little less, it's a little more mysterious to me. And I'm not sure we get the same sort of reaction to people, because I think people can equate their own circumstance a bit with it, but it's hard for them to comprehend, I think, a lot of the work that we do out there. And it's one of the things in USA that I think we realize we have to do a better job of, is getting the general U.S. population to understand the value of development assistance.
Could I just, before I ask the next question, could I just one piece, and I might ask Tom Arnold to, with his agricultural background, to back this up or contradict it. But we have a population of 4.5 million in Ireland, and I understand at the moment we produce enough food to feed 39 million people. So and by I'm not sure, is it 2020, we hope to be producing enough food to feed 15 million people. So for a country with a population of 4.5, and what strikes me as interesting about that is that the foundation of the Irish state in the 1920s was absolutely founded on agriculture. And then in a way, that faded, and other things became more powerful as elements, and agriculture declined in some ways. But the interesting piece, one of the interesting pieces that's happening at the moment, is that agriculture is absolutely on the way back, and in the context of an economy that's struggling overall, the agri sector is actually doing very, very well. It's just another interesting piece in the journey. So next question, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dirk Solomons, Columbia University. I was very intrigued by the examples that Ami gave of the work that the Clinton Foundation does. You see innovative ideas, public-private partnerships, new technology, and clearly they benefit tens of thousands of people who are the direct beneficiaries. USAID, Greg gave some examples of not the work done on nutrition. Brendan described some pilot projects. But to me the question is, okay, all these things, the lessons learned, how do you scale it up? How do you get to the point which Brendan made, that ultimately it needs to be government ownership? How do you cross the threshold? Haiti, for example, all wonderful, but you're looking at land ownership problems, which the best will not get done. So there are many issues. How do you make that transition? How do you get to the point where this becomes, from lessons learned, good common practice?
That's very good, very interesting. So the question of scale, Ami?
That
Over
is
to you.
a very good question, and is really the question that we're grappling with at the foundation. President Clinton started it 10 years ago, and so I think we've had exactly that introspective conversation, that we have created a lot of very interesting programs, and how do we scale them up? I'll give you a specific example. The work that we've been doing in Rwanda and Malawi has been at the invitation of those two countries' governments, and we have been working in very close partnership with their executive branches and the ministries of agriculture, with the goal of always doing our work alongside them so that they can continue it into the future. So I think in those two countries, that's the way in which we're trying to answer the scale question, is just helping them build this into their systems. That's what Brendan was talking about in terms of country leadership. In terms of taking it even beyond those two countries, all of our work is reliant on donor funding, and so a big part of what President Clinton is doing now is trying to fundraise in order to expand that work to a third country, hopefully sometime later this year, and perhaps a fourth and fifth next year or the year after. So that's specifically how we're approaching the scaling up in terms of that program. In terms of the work in Colombia and Peru, it's a very similar process of just trying to identify other parts of the country geographically that are interested in doing this work in which we can be helpful, and also trying to find the private sector partners or the philanthropic partners who can provide the capital that you need in order to get this work done. Thanks.
It's a great question. It's one that we really struggle with, and I'll tell you, just looking back at the Horn of Africa this year, I mean, one of the big things, one of the big questions that came to us was that we have a small project that deals with risk reduction. It's basically insurance for passengers. And it's not yet ready for prime time in the sense of it can be scaled up easily. But we do know that people actually collected on it. People actually got some money back for animals that perished. The point for us there is that for us, that's the first time that's happened, where we've taken a commercial product and we've made it sort of pay off for some smallholders who were badly affected by drought. So the challenge is, okay, how do we scale that up? We're working on that. But on the other hand, if you look at a place like Ethiopia, about a decade ago, there was always an issue as a drought came on, there's suddenly a surplus of animals that come onto the market because everybody's animals start to decline at the same rate. So where's the offtake? How do you do that? It was done in a way that was, it was sort of ad hoc, catch as catch can. Move forward a dozen years, and one of the things we did was we invested in private abattoirs, people that wanted to start them up. And so we used our funds to back their investments. So if you go to Ethiopia now toward the south, what you see is there's a dozen modern abattoirs, halal. They all ship to the Gulf. They process a goat about every 10 minutes. And they ship, one abattoir can ship about 2,000 animals a day. Difference is that this drought, a lot of pastoralists had a place to bring their animals to sell them before they got to the point where they couldn't get a dime for them. And so now people that we would have fed in the past, or who would have lost their assets, now have a commercial way to do offtake. And so for us, since that was a good investment of our funds, we're going to keep trying to do that. We're going to try to keep doing that in places like Kenya. And I think what it says for us is sustainability. A lot of that has to be around private sector, what they're willing to invest in, encouraging them to do that. How do you bring new ideas into the market? One of the things we work on now is called an ag pull mechanism. That is, donors are putting up money to draw good ideas off the shelf or to create an incentive for research in agriculture to get, like, for storage, because it's estimated anywhere between 20 to 40% of the food goes to waste because of poor storage. So how do we develop those better storage for on-farm storage so smallholders don't lose what they used to lose? And I think a lot of that has to do with private sector, farmers understanding that there's a place to go get something at a reasonable cost. If it's seed, can you get that hybrid seed regularly? If you rely on government to distribute it, it doesn't usually work because they're late, okay, well. But if it's a private sector person that distributes it, it's in their interest to make sure it's on time. So I think what we're seeing is, from our perspective, that sustainability, bringing to scale, can be done if we use a private sector to help do that.
Thanks very much. Brendan, did you want to add anything?
Well, that's a very difficult question, first. But it's a key question. I don't think we can scale up. I don't think Greg can scale up. I don't think Amy can scale up, really, essentially. Scaling up has to happen in the country itself, firstly. And it has to be enabled by the government, except with basket cases, right? So scaling up has to be a national policy of but there has to be an enabling environment, which will then enable the private sector. Agriculture is the largest private sector in Africa. All of the subsistence farmers are private sector people, and they will respond to incentives. And scaling up will happen like a virus if it works, right? And if the enabling environment is there. Who creates the enabling environment? Government creates the enabling environment. What can we do? Work with government to ensure there's good governance, and they create the enabling environment, and we work with them on policies. Work with NGOs like Concern, who are working at the grassroots where they can connect with communities. And that enabling environment from the government can use NGOs then as the service providers. And you get kind of a virtuous circle at that point. We can't do it, we can try and enable it to happen. But it's happening. I mean, I said this morning that the topic for another day would be the good news emanating from Africa. But over the last 6 or 7 years, where have been the fastest economic growth? Where have been Africa? 6 or 7%. The downturn, the recent downturn, which has almost claimed the life of my country, it didn't really affect Africa. One, they're not in the banking system really to the same extent. But certainly, they were able to get through this. And there's good news coming. For example, in terms of development cooperation, when I started, national budgets was 60% development aid, 70% development aid, 50%. Now, the amount of development aid going into sub-Saharan Africa as a percentage of the own resources available to African countries, 10%. Own resources, taxation revenues, remittances are pouring in. What has been scaled up? Universal primary education has been scaled up right across Africa. There are more boys and girls at school than ever before. That's been scaled up. How was that scaled up? We made it. We enabled, we worked with governments enabling this to happen. So it is happening. There's good news coming out. In 1990, probably 3 democratic governments in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1990, it's about 33, 34 now. So that's scaling up. We're scaling up democracy. How is that happening? Really well. Berlin Wall coming down, a bit of pressure, enabling environment, new leaders, young people getting educated. So the scaling up is happening, really, essentially. We're enabling it. We're having conversations about it, funding certain aspects of it. Really, it's up to the governments themselves. In Ireland at one time, great debate between one or two NGOs and the government about should we be funding just NGOs or should we be funding governments? But one of the arguments we used at that point was we're not going to have an NGO run a foreign NGO run the government of Ireland, really, essentially. You've got to work with NGOs essentially, and you've got to work with governments. If we want to do ourselves out of a job, we'd have an exit strategy. It's got to be working with governments, really, essentially. There's no other alternative.
Thank you. Kevin?
I couldn't say anything after that Dundalk speech. That was superb.
Thanks very much.
By the way, I would like to mention, before we close, this book I mentioned before will come out in August, More with Less. And it has some very, very interesting chapters by a lot of people, but when you talk of the cooperation with the private sector, I've always been fascinated as a physician how businessmen come into my office and just give me new ideas. At the end of the book, there's a chapter by Richard Branson, a chapter by Tom Freston, who ran Viacom and MTV in this country, a chapter by a hedge fund operator who got caught in the Taj Hotel. It's a wonderful chapter. But if you people who have been so good to come to this conference and stay in touch with my son Brendan, maybe we'll see if we get some money when that book comes out. You stay in touch with Brendan, and I'll try to send some copies. We might charge you.
Thanks. Kevin Cale, always young, and a man with great potential ahead of him, I think. Thanks, Kevin. You're amazing. Sorry, yes. Yes, okay, absolutely.
I'll make it very short.
Yeah.
My name is Marcina Popescu, and I'm a professor here at Fordham. I'm teaching in the area of international development. So I was very encouraged to hear, about a joint strategy being put together by development groups as well as humanitarian aid groups. And my first question is related to that, because as I know and as I see in various international development strategies, the two historically operated in silos. And the two paradigms are very different. So on one hand, when we talk about humanitarian aid, the need is to respond immediately. So you'll have food aid coming in. On On the other hand, with food aid coming in, local productions are being affected. So how do you see this strategy working to bring together a new paradigm maybe, or a different paradigm? That's my first question. My second question is, you mentioned the importance of collaboration, and that's very good, and we all want to see that, and the importance of bringing governments on board in this dialogue. However, how are we dealing with larger international policies, larger international trade policies? Because on one hand, yes, you want the government to take action and change their internal policies to support agriculture. On the other hand, you have larger policies that allocate subsidies or don't allocate subsidies, that manipulate the food price, and that also affects sustainability and local production. So how do you bring them on board, the international entities that need to take action as well?
Thank you very much. Brendan, did you want to ask?
I did.
You want to ask a question? Maybe we'll take them together.
Sure. My question really is to Brendan. You spoke very interestingly this morning about changing, shifting from 95% reaction to 95% planning, if you remember. And I just wanted you to expand on that. The idea of, in a world of a declining economy, and especially comparing yourself to the military, which has these vast resources, where the budget for the marching band of the United States is larger than most NGOs. How do you still have the impact that you want, especially as a government minister, if you're trying to make that shift from planning to reacting? That's one.
Thanks. Is there anybody else?
Could I?
Sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a point which is very similar to the colleague from Fordham.
This is Kevin Kelly,
Kevin Kelly
distinguished,
also from the Irish Foreign Ministry. No, it's just I was going to also make that point about linking relief and development. I think it's very clear. It's come up a lot today. We use concepts now like resilience and disaster risk reduction. As somebody who's just come back after 15 years in Africa, but mostly on the development side, and now in our humanitarian department, I'm very aware that there are very important distinctions. We talk about linking relief and development, but it's actually easier said than done. They're very, very different in many ways. There's very different kinds of people, different kind of language, different funding envelopes, different systems in terms of decision making, and also I think very important distinctions in terms of approach that need to be preserved, such as humanitarians with their focus on the humanitarian principles of impartiality and non-political engagement, and the development work, which is more political and more messy and more engaged. So there are very important also distinctions between the two that do need to be preserved. So I think I'd love to hear a little bit more from the panel about unpacking that concept of linking relief and development. I think it's not so much about blurring the distinctions, but in fact it's about understanding where the comparative advantages of both lie. I know that it's a priority for Ireland as we go into the presidency next year, because the Danish are currently the presidents of the European Union. And after them, it's the Cypriots and then Ireland. And what we would like to do is to be much more practical when we talk about linking relief and development. What does it actually mean on the ground? I came from a meeting recently in Copenhagen of the European Union member state humanitarians, and they're really grappling with these issues. It's down to things like who pays? Who pays for resilience work? Is it the humanitarians should pay, or is it the development program? One important view that was expressed in that meeting that I was at is that the humanitarians very often can be the champions for resilience. We can be the champions for a focus on linking relief and development around disaster risk reduction. But we can't take that on. We can't ultimately drive the agenda. That has to become part of the development discourse. So I think it was interesting to hear Greg talk about what you're doing in the US. In Ireland, it's perhaps easier. We're a bit smaller. Our ministry, we talk to each other on a daily basis. We can have these discussions and make those links. But in bigger administrations, it's actually quite difficult. So if there are some practical suggestions from the panel about how we can unpack those concepts a little bit more in ways that will be very practical moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Not just, I suppose, just your your contribution and your passion as well underlined that this whole journey is about actually the quality of and the passion of the people who work at the coalface of it, and you can hear it running through the contribution of everybody today. This isn't just a professional engagement on the part of people. This is also very, very personal, and it's a privilege to be around that. So,
Tim, can I just throw in?
Yes, Liam, of course, the director.
Suddenly appearing. Maybe we can throw them all in together.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, can you hear me?
I know, I'd like you to go to the microphone, please, dear director. Thank
You
you.
just wanted to be able to say that, I think. This arises from listening to it between the cracks of a few things, and it's another way of staging the last question, but spinning it in a different way. And really, it's for Brendan, I think, and Greg. Development, it seems to me, has been pushed, cajoled, ended up at a central place in the foreign policy, both of the United States and Ireland. In very different ways, but I think that has happened in recent years. The foreign policy is much more than development, and foreign policy includes a range of interests that it doesn't seem to be necessarily always aligned with development. Now that's an interesting area to explore, and rather than push you on one question on that, I just wonder if you would reflect on what tensions can emerge from that scenario. Thanks.
Okay, that's very interesting indeed. All right, well, let's have a go at that. So it's around the kind of a recurring theme of relief and development. I'm thinking somewhere in there is the analogy of the fire brigade, but I can't quite. So the fire brigade is definitely relief, but I can't quite figure out what's the analogy for development. So I was kind of thinking the Department of Education. Anyway, that's actually what we're talking about here. So we'll start. Can I start with you, Ami?
Sure. I think Greg and Brendan probably have a lot more to add on this. What I can say is, I think, just to start with your question first, I think if you look at some of the work that happened under President Clinton's administration, there's a recognition that that your foreign policy interests are often best served if you invest in having strong neighbors. So that was part of the reason for NAFTA. And of course, the increase in trade between the US and Mexico has benefited Latin America more broadly and Canada. So I think there may be instances in which your foreign policy interests make you feel that investing in the development in another country would not be a good idea. But I can't think of any examples of that right now. I mean, even if you look in the Middle East or Latin America or Asia, I think most broadly, if you were to scan the world, it's in your foreign policy interest to invest in development. And I think you can see the inverse of that statement, that if you don't invest in development elsewhere beyond your borders, you often will have to, in one way or another, handle the issues that arise because of that lack of investment. So that's my 2 cents on that. In terms of linking relief and development, the one specific thing that I can point to is Haiti. And it's a very interesting thing. I was thinking when you were talking that it's not just about linking, most people think of that as the development agencies allocating their money to try to mitigate the effects of crises. There's also part of it that is having the humanitarians, when they're intervening, try to think about the long-term impacts of what they're doing. So, for example, in Haiti, there's kind of a multi-pronged approach. We've been working there since September 2008, before the earthquake. And so a lot of what we were doing was trying to provide Haitian entrepreneurs and Haitian farmers and Haitian educators and Haitian health officials with the tools they needed to do their jobs better. And that's the one thing that we found, at least through our work under President Clinton, is that usually people in the world know what they need to do and know how to do it. And it's not a question of swooping in and teaching them as outsiders. It's more engaging them in a conversation, trying to figure out what they are trying to do and what they don't have in that effort, and then trying to bridge that gap. And so that's a lot of what we were trying to do in Haiti. What we found, and this goes back to the question of scale, is that there are very simple things that help you to scale and also link relief and development. One of those things is investing in roads, which is probably the least glamorous thing that anyone can talk about, but roads benefit development, and roads are critical in humanitarian crises, and it's funny, I used to have this conversation with Raj all the time when he was running the Gates Foundation agriculture work, and we used to commiserate that, you know, we were both working on very interesting agricultural programs, but really if we wanted to have a systemic impact on agriculture, you would just build out roads. And you know, you see that in a place like Haiti. We work with a group of mango farmers where they lose 50% of their revenue, mostly because the mangoes get bruised on the way from farm to market. And they're just as sweet, but they don't look as nice, and so they can't sell them. And there's countless examples like that. So I think roads is one thing where you could concretely link the two things. And the other is finance. And by finance, Greg touched on insurance, which is a piece of it. But you know, we've found in our agriculture work that often a big reason why farmers are not able to feed themselves or feed their communities is because of the very high interest rates that they live with. And you know, they just can't borrow to grow their businesses. I mean, you know, as Brendan said, these are business people, and they respond to the market signals, but they can't. And so I think if we want to address development in a long-term way, we also should try to rethink how we provide financing to smallholder farmers. And you know, of course, by doing that, you would mitigate the effects of crises as well. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Andy. Greg?
I'm gonna let Brendan go first. We already agreed on that.
Brendan?
So we've
Is
Would
this,
be strong coffee.
I
so-
suppose, so you're saying for once, so Greg, as between Ireland and the United States, Ireland has the preeminent position.
Well, I think, I mean, there's a few questions there. On foreign policy, on Liam's question, I mean, the development budget in Ireland in the early 1990s, late 1980s was quite small and was a smaller proportion of the overall foreign affairs budget. So we had a relatively small division. And the NGO sector were great advocates for development and you know, kept the pressure on government to make sure that we got that budget, essentially. So we had a very good relationship, and there was this small community of the Foreign Affairs Division dealing with development, the NGO community, some of the missionaries, people who returned from Africa. This was a small community advocating for the budget. You then turn it around 2 or 3 years ago, where the budget of the division that I had is 3 times the size of the entire foreign ministry budget, right? And we're a division of the foreign ministry. So you see that there's a, you know, obviously this is going to change things in some way, essentially. And it's still that way, you know, essentially it's 2.5 times. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that Ireland is a small country of 4 million people. And our wealth and our well-being is based on foreign direct investment into Ireland and what we sell abroad, because our own market is small. So we need a stable international community. There's a fantastic market going to grow in Africa, there's markets in Asia. So we are investing in poverty reduction, we're investing in stability, and by the way, we're investing in our own future. And we have no qualms about saying that. And what the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is also finding, all the colleagues that work very closely with us, is that we're in the Obama White House. And when President Obama came to Ireland last May, and he was standing in front of thousands of people, cheering people in College Green, what did he say? Your work on hunger is fantastic. It means a lot to us. We like partnering you. This is great. This is, you know, music to my ears as the head of the division, because the Taoiseach said, the Prime Minister said, the President said. So they're saying, wow, this is good for foreign policy. We're in the Oval Office through the aid program, right? It seems that there's a confluence of interests. There's a confluence of moral interest, really. There's a confluence of economic interest. So there's no big issue really with that. I think in relation to the silos, you know, and I spoke this morning about that. I'm not sure if you were here, but one of the key issues that I said, we were in different worlds. I came back from heading up our embassy in Uganda in 2000, and I took over as Director of Emergency Operations. And we have been working on that side of the house in Angola for about 10 or 15 years. And we found out by mistake that our friends on the development side of the house, one of my good friends who I had coffee with, was sending a mission to Angola to look at, maybe this would be a priority country. We'd have to find out about it. Nobody else in the division seems to know about it. Well, we've been working in Angola for 10 years. So obviously we stopped that and we went together. That's the type of silo approach. And even, I think, in terms of the culture, Dominic, you come from the emergency side of the house. You're the adrenaline junkies. They're always out there dealing with things very quickly. I remember meeting Dominic in Janina on the border of Chad. Tom and I were our plane nearly came down that time. We got caught in a sandstorm. This is exciting stuff, really, essentially, as opposed to the mundane, long-term development work. But as I said this morning, it was quite clear to me, why should we, on the emergency side when I was director, be spending 3 or 4 million on an emergency in Ethiopia, and we have a full-scale country strategy in Ethiopia run by the embassy in Addis Ababa, and they don't seem to be aware of what's happening. So, the Productive Safety Net program, which is partially designed by this man sitting here, is this incredible social welfare, cash transfer, and public works system designed to ensure that the assets of poor farmers are not eroded over time. So that when the really tough times come, as they did last year, 2011, people's assets are still there. They're not selling goats, they're not taking their daughters out of school. So it's working in a realistic way. And the question is, that's great, that's a great idea, but how do you make it happen practically? Now, we did it because Kevin was there, working closely with the United States. We have very short lines of communication. You know, there's the minister, there's me, there's him, and then there's it's very quick to pick up the phone, things can be done very quickly. And we've got to do it, I think, in practical way. There are large conferences with papers emanate, nothing gets done. Important in terms of the intellectual ferment, the intellectual rigor and debate, but you need to do practical things on the ground. And what we do is we sit around the table with all of the people now, and we say, look, how do we ensure that we focus on bringing those two things together? We look at Ethiopia, we look at the 9 countries in which we work, and we say, let's do this, let's change the program. And then we're trying to influence in the EU, and we're talking to our colleagues in the EU, we're talking to the Americans. And I'm a firm believer, let's pilot something, let's show that it works, and then let's bring it up to scale. That's the way we do it. But we're still grappling with language, you know, fighting over, I was just saying, you know, fighting over the word resilience. What does it mean? What do I mean? People like academics. I'm a practitioner. Let's make this work. So it's a work in progress, but as I said this morning, a lot of progress has been made, but it's a long way to go.
Thanks. The opportunity, I love the opportunity to unpack something, so I think I can follow some things that Brendan said. One of the, I think, advantages I've had, at least in my career in aid, is that I've worked both sides of that aisle. I look back to, I used to run a political transition office, and then I also run the emergency office again. And when the tsunami hit back in 2004, 2005, and then the Pakistan earthquake, one of the things that we did at aid was we put our political transition in with our disaster. And what we got from that was the fact that as we were responding to the emergency, those guys were thinking about, well, okay, in 6 months, when we're all going to go home, well, what's next? So for the first time, what we did was we used that as a way to build the transition program into the development program. It's like if you look at the Pakistani, look at the Hindu Kush, it was limited, but it actually was a fairly successful effort on our part to bring those two sides together. So I'm going to fast forward to this conference in the Horn. I think one of the things that we did was we made it very clear that this was not a conference about development people around the table. This is a conference of humanitarians and development people. So if it was OCHA, it had to be UNDP. If it was, if it was me on the development side now, then it had to be my counterpart from emergencies. It took us, as I said, a number of months to get our team, because we're a lot bigger. I can pick up the phone, except I got to pick it up 10 times to, this guy and that, well, this part of the division needs this. So we're more complicated. And we have so many silos of money. But I do think that for us, the breakthrough that we got in the Horn, and you know some of those people in Ethiopia, those programs, if you look at them, a lot of the emergency money that's been in there, it's been in there for years. It's like Southern Sudan. My God, that's probably the best example of emergency programs that morphed into development programs. The whole thing of buying surplus commodities in Southern Sudan to use to feed other people was was off of emergency money. But it was, if you look at it, it really became a development program. So for development, for emergency people to say, hey, you know, we don't do that. Wait a minute. Anytime there's a complex emergency, you do it because you're there. Because for political reasons, we can't put our development money. So for us, it's a question of how do you move that transition? How do you make that transition work so that you have a back end to your emergency work? And then the question is, what do you do with your development program to make it more flexible? One of the things that's not on my file, but I used to run the famine early warning system. I ran it for 3 years and have stayed up on it for many years. The fact is, we have much better warning. So there's no reason why our development people, if they look at that data, can't be more flexible. It offers them an opportunity to do that. It's just how you structure your money. We do a thing called a crisis modifier, which allows a development guy to say, I can take 10% of all my money and I can shift it into a response mode if I want to. So that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to bring in there. The problem is we've got old-time development guys who simply don't want to do it. They don't want to do it because they've never had to do it and they're not comfortable with it. So all they want to do is turn to their emergency people. So I hate to, you know, you have to get rid of the old timers. You got to get come on, it's time. You know, one thing I will comment on, because I'm on a roll here, and that is that you know, I was pulled out of Namibia to go to Haiti, and I was our coordinator with the UN and the NGOs. So you know, when you look at the amount of money that the NGOs have, it was a ton of money, just a ton of money. American NGOs, I think the NGOs was over $1 billion. So I actually called a meeting of NGOs and said, I want to talk about your money, your relief money. Of course, you'd have thought I was the devil incarnate. How dare you, a donor, tell us what to do with our money? The fact is, they were in a perfect position to use their money for transition. Take that emergency money and do that. And in fact, what they wanted to do is, a lot of them just wanted to use it on their other development programs, but not see the importance of that transition work. And I think that is, I think when we move toward, back toward some other big disaster, I think that's something that NGOs have to think about, is when they get that kind of money, what is their role in that community? And they play a key role in transition because, as you know from President Clinton's effort to get the system going, it was going to take a while. But the NGOs were sitting on a pile of money. How do you use that together? So this alliance, this global alliance on whole, which involves relief and development groups, I hope that will be a prod to the industry as a whole to try to bring that together. And every country's going to have their own model. But we all have some similar components. So I think we've got some opportunities now to do some good.
Thanks very much. Kevin, do you want to, I'm very conscious of time now, so I'm just going to bring this to a close now for
Maybe if I began by saying we have to face facts, and you say that you look at the figures, it just strikes me, listening, facts are that Ireland's foreign policy and America's foreign policy are very different. And that does drive, I think with Irish aid, you say right on your front, we are going to give our aid regardless of the interest of Ireland to the people in need. Is that not correct, Brendan? Whereas American USAID says we are going to use our aid for the fostering of American foreign policy. You talk about hunger, and you can say we may not like North Korea, but it struck me just in the last few weeks. We just said we're not going to give you any more food in North Korea because that violated our foreign policy. So I think with all the goodwill between Ireland and America, there still has to be a recognition that they're two different foreign policies. Maybe that's my last word.
Thanks very much.
Or as you would say,
has somebody an absolutely burning, very short question? Tony has a very burning and short question, which will wrap up there. I'm going to give you the honor to be the last.
Okay, Tony Ahlstrom, and I must say, I just came from an educational conference in London, and there's a narrative quality to this conference of Irishmen that we didn't have in London.
Keep talking, Tony. You can take another 10 minutes.
But I'm here with one foot in two camps. I'm actually an educator. I'm the chairman of the board of the George Washington Scholars Endowment. Our first president gave the largest gift in the history of philanthropy for poor and orphan children, little known fact. But I'm also working with Feed the Children. And our idea is to build a great academy and actually take boys and girls out of this Kibera, one slum of Nairobi, and resettle them. And it involves private equity capital here. We're putting together an American business, and involves a lot of things. But the idea is an academy. We're working on a model for an academy-based community, an ABC, where the center of this new community is an academic institution. And I know Brendan, you talked a little bit about the importance of schools, and I'm over here nodding. Are there any models out there that we could look at here in New York to build an academy-based community that would really be, you know, a developing nation kind of local development?
Very interesting. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Great. Power of education and the heart of it. Anybody want to?
Winfrey, somewhere.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Kevin?
I just wonder whether that's a good idea, to bring the children out and set up a separate academy. I think it is really a whole day's philosophical thinking about the wisdom of moving people out of their communities.
I think Kevin put his finger on a very important issue there. I would question the wisdom, I think, of creating an oasis of perfection, really, in a sense, in a system that's a bit dysfunctional. And I certainly, in the past, would have been critical of funding to particular schools in particular areas. I felt that in the final analysis, we have got to enhance the quality of education through the system, really, essentially. And we learned that the hard way in Irish Aid. We had a project approach in the 70s and the 80s, and I think there's another discussion the year after next, Liam, on this one, you know, the project approach, really, essentially. But when I took over as head of mission in Uganda, we were funding a girls' school in Karamoja. And I don't know if any of you have been to Karamoja, but it's a very wild place. And the Karamojong folks think that all the cattle in the world belong to them, which is troublesome for the neighboring regions and even the neighboring countries. So we're currently working there, but certainly pastoral people, a lot of arms, a lot of violence, a lot of gender-based violence, and a very, very difficult place to work. And there was a school there called Kangole Girls' School, and we were funding that. And I visited them then in 1998, 1999, and I must say I changed my mind, because this was the only education that Karamojong girls were getting. They were protected, essentially, and the graduates went on to, you know, good things. They were the only female graduates from the Karamojong tribe, and to this day we continue to subscribe to that school. So what I would say to you is, I know what you want to do, and I know you want to give young men and women from Kibera an opportunity. And what I would say is, talk to people in the sector, have a look at what is possible. As Kevin said, I don't think people should be taken out of their country or out of their community, but there must be some way where you can give young men and young women from that slum an opportunity that they wouldn't have, and they need a helping hand. And I would say, have a look at it, think about it, learn what's happened, talk to us in our organization, talk to USA, talk to NGOs that have been doing in the education sector, and think it through. And maybe you'll come up with a model that would be worth trying. Thanks.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, and thank you, and every good wish for your work, Tony, and you have an offer there to discuss. So with that, I think unless there's any other comment from the panel, I'd like to draw this to it.
3 o'clock. 3 o'clock is the next.
Yeah, well, a bit of networking is good. I just want to just to mark, there's a few people here I'd just like to acknowledge. Peter Hansen, the fantastic work that he has done over so many years. Great that you're here with us today, Peter. We really appreciate the sterling work, and I know your friendship with Kevin is good enough for me as a mark of your quality as a human being. I also want to acknowledge Jackie O'Harlan, who is Deputy Consul General at the Consulate, and thanks, Jackie, for being here with us. And when I was mentioning, I know Liam will be wrapping up on behalf of the Institute, but I also want to acknowledge the contribution of Dr. Andrew Sanders, who's here with us, also in addition to Catherine. It's been a great session. It's been very, very interesting. It's been very powerful. And on all your behalf, it's my privilege and responsibility now to thank each of the panelists for being with us and for giving us the richness of their experience and also the richness of their passion for what they do. Dr. Kevin Gale, Brendan Rogers, Greg Gottlieb, and Amy Desai. Thank you very much.
I used to be the consul general down here. Yeah, I used to be. Yeah, okay. Done and dusted. So, building justice, wording up. I heard you were coming. I had a note from George. That's it. He said he sent me a text. Are you from okay, Kevin. I knew that. Are you based here? So Boston went well ahead. What? I thought I did answer you. How was the gig? Somebody takes a big thing. Heavy? Yeah. People are really sorry. Yeah. It's always a difficult one to go into, to deliver kind of message.
stage. It's amazing looking at the guy. Yeah, there was a stage where I was going to go, and he actually looked back down to the script. And I don't know if the next script I don't know if it's on our website. Is it on your website? Are you okay with it? Where in Calcutta before? I've been in Uganda, you know Nuala O'Brien then? Uganda, you have to do how do I get back? Great. It's how the hell did they send me? What did they do to get sent home? And Western. I was here actually in New York. Interesting. Well, I haven't had contact with the start. I haven't had much. What's that like? What do you imagine? Yes, or Dublin, New Africa. Sure.